Well, it's finally here, the TURBOGRAFX-16 Mini. It finally came. So, what do I think of it? Well, it sucks. Just kidding. I'm not what I would consider to be a master at reviewing these mini consoles, or emulation in general, but I do have over 25 years of solid experience with this console and its library of games. It was my first console I ever had, and to this day remains one of my favorites for many reasons. So, given that, I think I can have a fairly useful opinion on it for you if you are on the fence about buying one. So I'm gonna judge this primarily through that lens. Right off the bat, the form factor is great. It gets all the obvious details and most of the smaller ones right, all the way down to the back cover exposing your power and video outports, and the little switch in the front, which is awesome. They also upgraded from the original in a couple of ways, by adding a second controller port, and by giving the controller a much longer cord than the originals. You probably won't need an extension for the Mini like you probably do for the OG, and I appreciate that. Overall, the thing looks great, and it's funny how it's able to make me feel nostalgic for a console that I still have sitting right over there. The Mini includes an HDMI cable and a USB cable for power, but no power brick. So if you're not like me and don't happen to have a bunch of these floating around, that might annoy you, and understandably so. If you do want to use one of your own and not buy the official one, then just make sure you use one that isn't sending more than 5 volts to the system. Apparently some people's minis have fried because they've done that, so keep that in mind. But let's get into the meat and potatoes here. The library of available games on the system is overall pretty nice. You've got lots of great shoot-em-ups like Airzonk, Blazing Lasers, and Psychosis, a few platformers like JJ and Jeff and New Adventure Island, and some oddball games from different corners of the library. Even some heavy hitters like Newtopia, Bonk's Revenge, Ease, and Alien Crush. Can't go wrong with those. That's not to say there aren't some absolutely glaringly obvious omissions though. In particular, Legendary Axe, Keith Courage, and Devil's Crush are nowhere to be found. I mean, Legendary Axe was huge for the system, so to not have that is bizarre. Keith Courage wasn't the best game of all time, but it was the pack-in game, and it's very historically relevant because of that. Also, Devil's Crush is Devil's Crush. Alien Crush is on here, and that's good, but come on, Devil's Crush. I can give Konami a pass on not having games like Bloody Wolf or even Legendary Axe 2. But these 3 games really needed to be here for the library to feel complete, at least to me. That said, I don't want to harp on that too much because deep down, I know that if they had included those games, I'd probably be complaining about Bloody Wolf not being there, and if they had that, I'd be complaining about it not having Cybercore, and if they had that, I'd probably be complaining about it not having Clax, or Gunboat, Manhole. To be honest, what is here does a pretty good job of characterizing the TurboGrafx's library. Shooters, some platformers, a couple RPGs, and some oddball games that sort of defy classification. The PC Engine library, which is also included here and you can switch to by switching the console on the bottom right of the menu, is also represented pretty well in the same way, although good luck playing some of them if you don't know Japanese. Snatcher, in particular, is virtually unplayable if you don't. Ultimately, though, I think Konami has done a good job here, smartly utilizing the IP they already own like Castlevania, as well as what they gained from absorbing Hudson Soft, who made the majority of the Turbo's most beloved games. Also China Warrior. Konami even stepped outside the IPs they own, and snagged a few games from third parties like Splatterhouse from Namco. That actually took a little investment on their part, and doesn't go unnoticed by me. If I had to grade the library as a whole, I'd probably give it a solid B. It definitely missed a few opportunities, but overall it's pretty good. If you've never played the TurboGrafx before and spend a few hours with this library, you'll come out of it with a pretty good idea of what it was like. And I think that's the most important thing. As far as the emulation of the games goes, I also feel pretty satisfied. Now, my opinion is not that of an emulation guru who obsesses over every little detail, but as a guy who has played most of these games for over 25 years and would definitely notice anything horribly wrong with them and tell you about it, I honestly don't have any major complaints here. The first thing I did when I started up my Mini was play all the way through Airzonk, non-stop from beginning to end. My muscle memory fell right into place with it, and I had no issues beating the game about as easily as I ever would. Even Splatterhouse, a game that is known for being a bit clunky and weird to control, felt right to me, and I was able to, again, rely on my decades of muscle memory with the original hardware and beat it just as well as I normally would. Now, are there instances of shimmering and input lag that I noticed from time to time? Absolutely, but even at their worst, I never really found them to be major problems. Even in Lords of Thunder, which seems to be the game most reviewers are complaining about, honestly feels fine to me despite a tiny amount of lag. I don't know what else to say. I just disagree with the severity of the complaints I'm hearing about the lag. It's not perfect, but I really do think it's fine and totally playable. Honestly, my biggest complaint with the emulation is something I haven't seen anybody else bring up at all, and it's that some of the music in the games sounds a little flat. It doesn't really pop out of my speakers the way it does coming from an actual system with a set of component cables, but even that I rarely notice. There are some bells and whistles thrown in, like different aspect ratios, background designs, save states, and a scanline filter, which is better than nothing, but I would have appreciated a little bit more. A way to adjust the intensity of the scanlines would have been nice, and I definitely would have liked a smoothing option. It's not the end of the world, but for $100, I think a little more in the visual options department would have been more appropriate, although I do like the Turbo Express filter. I'll never really use it, but I like it. A huge deal with any of these mini consoles is going to be the controller, and this is another area that I think they mostly get right, but just not totally. The D-pad definitely feels a little stiff to me, and the run and select buttons are a tad mushy and shallow for my taste. Kind of reminds me of the old school controller that I reviewed in another video. You can watch that if you want. That said, the main buttons and the switches are fine, and I don't think it's a bad controller overall. It gets the job done just fine. So while I don't hate it, I'm probably going to look into trying out one of 8BitDo's alternatives for a more long-term solution myself. So with all of that said, do I recommend the TurboGrafx Mini? Well, in a general sense, yeah, I think I do. But whether or not it's right for you will largely depend on what you want to get out of your retro gaming experience, and where you stand on the spectrum of unadulterated authenticity versus convenience and affordability. If you are on either extreme of that spectrum, this might not be for you. It's certainly not the most authentic option out there, and it's certainly not the cheapest either. It's somewhere in the middle. But as a guy who tends to lean towards forking over the money for authentic hardware and upscalers and all that stuff, I personally find the balance that this Mini strikes between accuracy and accessibility to be a pretty good one overall. If you are okay with trading a little bit of authenticity, the TurboGrafx Mini makes sure you get a lot in return. If you're new to the TurboGrafx, I recommend it to you even more so, as many of the games included here would, on their own, run you much more than the cost of the Mini itself, and that's not including a system and the cords and adapters you need to get it looking decent on a modern TV. So, the value is definitely there. Despite me usually preferring original hardware, I'll still probably play this going forward a lot of the time if I'm being honest. Not only to preserve my original games and hardware, but also just out of sheer convenience. The system doesn't knock any one aspect totally out of the park, but it also doesn't really get anything particularly wrong. I honestly think for the vast majority of those interested, it's probably worth checking out.